Here is a short introduction to real-world flying of the Just Flight Vulcan, demonstrated in X-Plane 11, but just in time for the launch of the Microsoft Flight Sim version. On the runway, holding the aircraft on the brakes, control column about an inch forward, all four throttles forward, holding on the brakes, set 80% power, even throttle response, full power. Nose wheel steering is used all the way up to 100 knots, then transferring to deep and straight using the rudders. 135 knots at light rate. Relax the back pressure, ease the aircraft into the air, brakes on, off, and select gear up. Accelerates very quickly, so you need to throttle back a little bit to stop the speed completely running away. There's the gear up with the lights out, 215 knots, and approaching 1500 feet. Note that operation by itself has used 2G, which in itself is the limit for all Vulcan flying. No more than 2G, no less than maintaining positive G, which is very difficult to achieve. Normal flying in the Vulcan is at low level is flown around 240 knots, but accelerating to 300 knots for attack runs. Above 250 knots, then the field lock must be engaged. Here is the field lock in the real Vulcan at the front of the PFCU and auto start and stop panel, which is just on the outboard side of the captain's seat. So we've departed what used to be RF Kinloss, heading towards Inverness, where we're scheduled for a brief mini display of the wing over. So letting down to low level now, throttling back. You can see on the dashboard in this little white square is the air brake indicator. When it's white, it means the air brakes are out at either the mid setting or the high drag setting. Gently bring the speed back to 240 knots for low flying, and settling down around about 500 feet. Or actually in this case, as the radar shows, a little bit lower than that. At low level, 240 knots plus or minus a speed correction to make your time on target. Notice the air brake indicator is now black, showing the air brakes are in. While we're here at low level, I'll just show you a couple of things you may not be familiar with in this airplane. This is the hydraulic gauge down here, which shows the main brake pressure of 4000 psi up and down on the left, and the brake pressures on the two banana-shaped scales. Not much of a view out of the Vulcan, as you can see, so pretty uncomfortable at low level. Comfortably settled at low level now. We're cruising in, looking out for Inverness Airfield. Notice that everything about the airplane in terms of control inputs is smooth and slow. All important not to exceed the 2GG limit. Remember, it's pretty agile, but it isn't an F-16. Moving around the back of the airplane, you see the bump on top of the tail there, which is where the brake parachute is. The rounded bump on the back is the tail warning radar, and this red steer. Top of the fin, square aerial is the 18228, which is the radar warning receiver aerial. And you see the air brakes are out, in this case at the mid-drag setting. Two other settings. Further selection of the air brake switch moves into high drag, and then put the gear down. It gives you a bit more angle on those blades you see sticking up, so more drag still. Remember, all Vulcan approaches are made with the air brakes selected to the high drag position finally. Here we are, running in at Inverness. right nose high, ideally about 160 knots, not much faster, certainly not any slower. Gently applying 2 G's worth of back pressure to get the nose up as high as you dare. Speed coming back, certainly not below 130 knots, and then a full-scale roll input in the direction of your wing over. Over the apex, rolling the bank off, maintaining the back pressure, throttles fully idle, and as you can see, air brakes out, otherwise the speed runs away with you. Trying to control the speed back to something around about 240 knots by the time you get back to low level. Here's the same wing over from a slightly different angle. And actually, I think that doesn't look unlike what we used to do in 558. So, away from Inverness into a low-level portion down the Great Glen, Vulcan in its low-level element, usually at 500 feet, but in places like Canada, then sometimes flown down to 100 feet, which is very interesting in an aeroplane with a 111-foot wingspan. So here we are, inside view from low level. There's a 238 knots in this case, cruising along. You can see I have already understressed the aeroplane at some point during the trip, which would be a big no-no because it would require a serious check of the rigging of the aeroplane when it got back to the hangar. This, from memory, is a pretty good facsimile of what low level in the Vulcan looked like most of the time. But even on a nice day in Scotland, sometimes things can go wrong, and today I fear will be no exception to that rule. Just enjoying the scenery, looking around, eyes dropping. If you look at the number 1 and number 2 engine RPM gauges, you'll see they're falling, so there's been some unknown failure of both engines. It's always assumed in the Vulcan that if you lost one engine, you would lose the one next to it for various reasons. So the 2 white indicators just above the RPM gauges are the fuel pressure gauges at the inlet to the engine, showing there's no fuel going into the engine, which is because actually I've switched off the low pressure brakes. So we're now asymmetric, flying number 2, number 3, number 4 engines, the 2 right-hand engines. First thing we need to do is pull that black and yellow striped handle on the top of the coaming around their turbine, the rat, which does 2 things. One, it drops a small electrical turbine into the airflow, which is only of any use really above about 20,000 feet. But the other thing that it does is what's called shed the non-essential electrics. So you say, so what? What that does mean is that of the 14 fuel tanks in the aeroplane, 10 of them are no longer available to you. So you're left with the 4 fuel tanks which are at the front of the aeroplane in the fuselage, which means you no longer have a massive amount of fuel. So it's time to start looking for an airfield to divert to as close as possible. I think probably you can hear the Vulcan howling. In reality, the best Vulcan howl is always with 2 engines throttled back and the other 2 engines set to about 95%. So actually, hats off to Just Flight. They modelled that really well. And there you go, you can see the ram air turbine dangling below the left wing there. And you can see there's only smoke coming out of the right-hand engines to prove I'm not cheating. So eventually we get back, in this case we get back to RF Kinloss because it was the nearest suitable airfield for our approach. flying this a little bit faster than I would have done normally, but it's probably no bad thing with the genuine double asymmetric problem. As you can see, the air brakes at the moment are out. They are at mid at the moment, but when I roll out pointing the runway, then I would further select the air brakes out to select the high drag position. Important in the Vulcan to get lined up as early as possible, because the runway rapidly disappears from your view. There we go, you can see the air brakes are out, in common with every other Vulcan approach that you should make. Approached a bit faster, consequently landed a bit further down the runway than would be ideal, but it's still okay. Once the wheels are on the ground, order the co-pilot to stream the brake chute below 145 knots so it doesn't tear off. Apply standard brake pressure, and the airplane will stop fairly smartly for such a big airplane. I hope you found this an enjoyable introduction to flying the Just Flight Vulcan.